Welcome to Los Altos History. I'm your hostess, Nancy Schnabel, and with me tonight is Rosemary Meyerott, who is historian of Los Altos Hills. And she's going to tell us some of the history of Los Altos Hills up until the time of their incorporation. What's interesting about Rosemary is she's worked hundreds of hours in a little room in back of the Los Altos Hills Town Hall, and what makes her very unique is that she's done it as an unpaid volunteer. She's an example of how one person can make a unique, major contribution to a community. She was a 1986 recipient of the joint Los Altos Hills Community Volunteer Awards. Rosemary, welcome to Access Los Altos. Now, many people might not realize how difficult it is to be a historian and to collect historical data. And you told me you even have some mystery families that you're trying to find out more. And maybe you in the audience will be the person that can help us find these missing links. But how did you get interested in the history of Los Altos Hills?
Well, it all started back in the early 60s. I have a daughter who was a polio patient who had lots of surgery. And she had to have home teachers to help her. And one of them was Virginia Tafe of the Tafe family. And she was she started telling me and Gail all about her family's history in the hills. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. So then Florence Fava wrote her wonderful book, The Los Altos Hills, A Colorful Story. And I couldn't wait for it to get out. And in the meanwhile, she started the Los Altos Hills Historical Society and really needed some help. So I joined the Historical Society and worked with them for a few years. And then Florence resigned from her position of Los Altos Hills Town Historian. And I was then president of the Historical Society. So the council just appointed me to come in and take over doing the history. I'm not an historian per se.
She says this, but she knows more history than most of us will ever know. Florence Fava, just in case there's someone in our audience that doesn't know who she was, devoted a great deal of her life to helping learn more research about the Ohlone Indians. And could you tell us a little bit about the Indians that
that's
used to live
another
here?
reason that I got interested in the history. I'm a lover of Indian history. And so that was another thing that got me into it.
What were the Ohlones like?
The Ohlones were just very peaceful people that they lived actually down on the bay in the winter and then came up into the hills and hunted deer and even fished for salmon in Adobe Creek, I'm told. Now, I've never heard of a salmon in Adobe Creek.
Sounds like a long journey.
Yeah, but in those days, the hills were just lush with elk and deer and berries and just everything that they could want to live.
It's amazing to think of how it's changed.
And then, of course, when the missions were built, the Ohlones were practically made slaves.
After the Ohlones, the Spanish came, And the prime Spaniard, if we want to put it that way, that came through our area, and I'm going to look till I don't say his name wrong, was Juan Bautista de Anza, the expedition in 1776. And he was a very courageous man. He was one of the things he was most known for. He never let his soldiers go hungry, which was very unusual in those days. But he found the inland way to Monterey Bay and San Francisco Bay. And on his way to San Francisco Bay, he passed through both Los Altos and Los Altos Hills. Where in Los Altos Hills did he go?
Well, it was traced on a map that he came through approximately Edith Avenue and into along Fremont Road. And in 1976, there was a reenactment of the De Anza trek. And one of our townspeople, Joseph Docknell, took the place of Corporal Robles, and he rode on the Lancers. Well, it was a group of horsemen, and they wore authentic costumes, and our town had a costume made for Doc, and that is now in my little history room behind a glass case.
And could you tell me about the land grants?
Well, Los Altos Hills is comprised of two land grants, San Antonio Rancho, or Rancho San Antonio, and La Purísima Concepcion. And La Purísima Concepcion was granted to two Indians who were emancipated neophytes from the Santa Clara mission. And their names were Jose Gorgonio and his son Jose Ramon. And it was approximately 1840 or that they were granted this property. And they were, stories are told that they were attacked by thieving Tulare Indians who burned their houses and injured their wives and made off with their horses. And so they had to rebuild their huts. They lived like Ohlone Indians in the regular Ohlone Indian huts.
Now, who took them over? You told me something about somebody thought they weren't doing a very good job of it and thought they sort of stepped in.
Juana Briones de Miranda decided she wanted to move down and buy the land that the Indians had. So she made them an offer of $300 for, let's see, approximately, well, each rancho had about 4,436 acres. Now, both San Antonio and Purísima Concepcion.
Did she get both of them for $300?
No, she got just essentially La Purísima Concepcion. And anyway, when she bought the property from the Indians, they couldn't write. And so they signed their life away with X's. Oh. And Juana built an adobe house of 3 rooms on what is now Adobe Road, Palo Alto. And it's been added on to. It's quite large now, but it's still standing. And let's see, she was quite a woman. She was very strong.
I heard that she was. Someone told me that it was so difficult to travel in those days, and she had a lot of children, and she gathered up all the kids and all the foodstuffs, and by ox cart, with her holding the reins, it was a 3-day trip to San Francisco to sell her wares. I mean, the idea of anyone doing this, but she was a very small woman. I mean, I always think of her as a real pioneer powerhouse type, and we're lucky to have had her.
Well, she was the nurse to all the Indians and other people around. She ministered to the sick and brought them into her home. So she didn't have a very happy married life, though.
Well, she was one of the first women to ever divorce her husband, and he was so bad, they said that he'd committed heinous crimes against her and civilization, and they gave her his lands. she became a very, very wealthy woman.
Mm-hmm. Well, this land that she bought, Santa Clara Mission cattle had grazed on these lands. That's 14 miles away from that area. So
she owned a lot.
They had quite a bit. She didn't own all of that, but I mean, the mission sent the cattle over.
And didn't you tell me that a lot of our roads in Los Altos Hills are named after members of her family?
Well, first of all, I'd almost forgotten. We named one Briones in the 1960s, but some of the streets that are still in existence are Miranda, Manuela, who was a daughter, Concepcion, Josefa, which runs off of Elena Road, and I guess that's all from her family.
And then there was another family that contributed greatly to Los Altos Hills history, wasn't there? Well,
let's see. The person who was granted the other piece of land, it was, let's see, Juan Prado Mesa. He was granted Rancho San Antonio in 1839, and the site of his first adobe is supposed to be up on a hilltop on bordering Summerhill and El Monte.
And could you tell me a little bit more about, I'm going to skip a little bit here, the Murphys and the Taifs were a family that intermarried. The Murphys settled Sunnyvale, and they intermarried with the Taifs, and Martin Murphy gave his daughter, Elizabeth Yuba Murphy, quite a wedding present when she married William Taif. Tell him what it was.
He bought 2,800 acres from Juana Briones, and that was the wedding present of Elizabeth Yuba Murphy Taif. And so we have some street names after her.
Good.
Elizabeth, which is now deleted, and someday I hope to get it back on. And Yuba was deleted. And then, but they had children, 5 children.
And we have names after all of them?
They were named Elena. Now that's the road that I live on.
Oh.
And that is from one of her grandchildren.
Now, did part of that land, excuse me for interrupting you, did part of that land include what is now Foothill Campus?
Yes. Now their first house, the first one that William and Elizabeth Yuba Murphy moved to, was here on Foothill Campus. And they moved here in 1861.
Wow.
And that house is no longer standing.
But
it was situated over where the faculty house is.
I see.
In that area.
But there is a house that is standing that was built, let me consult my notes, I'm terrible on dates, I have to look at notes, the Griffin House. Tell us about the Griffin House, because that's here on Foothill Campus also.
Well, the Griffin House was built in 1901 by Willard Griffin, who was a shipbuilder from Boston. And he bought I think it was 90 acres of land for $10,000 in gold coin, it said. And he really made the property a showplace.
Now, where is that house now? Can you tell people in the audience?
Griffin House is still standing.
But where can you tell people where it is?
Well, it's right across from the firehouse, which was the carriage house for the Griffins. And then behind the Griffin House, he built a lovely Japanese shrine and bridge over a lake, a man-made lake, and I think it was probably fed by Adobe Creek that went through this Foothill campus until it was diverted into concrete when the campus was built. It's amazing how this area
has changed. And now we have this mystery family. And see if you can help Rosemary on this, because you've all heard of the Dana, and we have a Dana Road in Palo Alto. There's a Dana in Mountain View, and is there a Dana in Los Altos Hills?
No, it's a Dana House.
And there's a Dana House, and I'm going to read right off my script if you'll forgive me. Henry F. Dana owned half of Rancho San Antonio, but the man who built what is now the present faculty house of Los Altos, of Foothill College, was a Henry
A. Dana and his wife, Lily P. Dana. And it was assumed that Henry F. Dana built the house, but from researching it, he was dead by the time that house was built. So I've checked with Liz Dana's husband, that's Liz Dana.
But no, you can't find any links?
And he has, no, they didn't have anything in their genealogy, and they had quite a few books of it.
Anybody out there that knows this missing link, please let us know by calling either the station or call it Rosemary at Los Altos Hills Town Hall.
That house was sold by Dana in 1908 to Grace Holt, who was John Loman's mother.
And the Loman house is now the faculty house, right?
The Loman House is now Foothill Faculty.
I'd like to shift to how were the early children in Los Altos Hills? Where did they go to school?
Well, the first little one-room schoolhouse was built in 1901 on, it's now Duval Way, but it was actually Robledo Road. And it went from the first to the 8th grade, and the last class was held there in 1953. And I went to a reunion last summer of all the old people that went to that school, and it was really fun.
And now
they
it's
were
a church?
all, you know, agricultural. Their fathers were into, well, raising prunes and apricots and cattle. And the children all went to school on the dirt roads. They rode their ponies or came in little pony carts.
Oh.
And all the Tafe family went to that. And
I understand. Another thing that there were a lot of were tank houses in Los Altos Hills. Could you tell us a little bit about those?
That's one of my loves, and they're all getting torn down.
Yeah, I wish they could save them.
Two of my favorites are the one on Campo Vista that was built in 1914 by Alan Cranston's family. And as you all know, Alan Cranston is our state senator. And that's still standing, and it's on property owned by Donald Winbigler, and next to a lovely home that was built in 1926 by Dr. Crane. You know, the white one you were asking me about.
Oh, it's gorgeous. Another thing I'd like to ask you.
Then you want to hear anything else about the other really picturesque water tank is over on Fremont Hills Country Club land, and that was built for a widow named Martha K. Lynn in 1906 by, with help from Harold Brubaker. The Brubakers, you know, were...
Yes, Otto Brubaker. That rings a bell. I'm going to skip a little bit again. You know, you mentioned to me, and I'd never known this, that we had wineries around here on what is now called Page Mill and then Arastadero Roads. Would you tell first how Page Mill Road got to be called Page Mill, and what is the meaning of Arastadero Road?
Well, let's see. Page Mill, they used to take lumber down, and to actually Page Piers, what do you call it? Lumber mill in Palo Alto. They took lumber from the sawmills in the mountains.
And then how about Arastadero?
And then Arastadero was, it means to drag or skid road. Wood was dragged from the hills to the bay where it was used to fuel the wood-burning ships. Ships used to come down and pick up all of the supplies from the area or things that the farmers would sell and take up by boat to San Francisco.
How times have changed.
Yeah.
You told me about one of the wineries, Mrs. Eugenia Andriano.
Yes.
Tell us more about her.
Well, she and her husband decided they wanted to buy a farm in what's now Los Altos Hills in 1922, and they walked all the way from Middlefield along Arastadero, and having read this ad in a San Francisco paper, and fell in love with the area and bought it. And so they farmed it until 1935 when Mr. Andriano died, and Eugenia decided to make the barn into a winery. She was from Italy and had learned the art of winemaking from her father. So she, with her 3 children, establish this winery. And it really got to be well known. It was on the corner of Rastradero and Purissima.
And you've actually been there, haven't you?
Oh, yeah. And when I first moved to the Hills in '56, you were allowed to go there and take your own bottle, gallon jug, and for $1 you could get your choice of 3 wines. She was famous for Claret and Sauterne, and what was the other one? I can't think of it.
Didn't you give your children some sips
anyway,
sometime?
my children just loved to go there because she would take us down her basement. I remember her opening up those cellar steps, and we'd go down there into the little tasting room, and she'd even give the kids taste, and they thought it was wonderful. So.
Another thing I'd like to touch on, because I had never heard of this before you told me, we had a flying field in Los Altos Hills before Moffett Field. A family named the Eisenberg family had their own airstrip. And Rosemary, could you tell us some about that? Because it was an era that was just unimaginable now to have something like this.
His name, Los Altos Hills had its own landing strip before Moffett Field was even envisioned. About 1928, Rudolph Eisenberg, who was a wealthy man who owned a sugar plantation in Hawaii, who had a passion for airplanes and fancy cars, cleared a swath next to his home and made this, he created Eisenberg Field. And it was a strip used by many local aviators. It was a primitive runway, but it witnessed many landings and takeoffs of Wacos and Fairchilds and Pipers by some well-known daredevils of the day. Jack Nystrom of Palo Alto Airport, who is now dead, his son was one of our mayors. Raphael Myers of Los Altos, Bill Radcliffe, and Fred Harvey. And even, he even made a hangar in the shape of his airplane, and Bill Radcliffe humorously tells about having a windsock on this hangar, even though there was only one way to fly in or out, and it was just really, it was there for looks.
Could you tell me how John Foles and his wife, Eleanor Cranston Foles, got involved with Los Altos Hills? You had mentioned he was very active in the early history.
Well, we're kind of ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, but we're going to run out of time, so we're going to have to sort of go ahead.
So I know what you're leading into was this house that Gerda and Rudolph built in 1928 on Old Trace Road, known as Feather Hill Farm, was sold in 1942 to John Fowle and Eleanor Cranston Fowle. And so I'll get into them when I'm telling you about the founding of the town. But maybe you, am I supposed to describe any pictures?
Well, I think we're going to be, we're going to be running out of time on this. So what I'm going to do is we're going to show you a sequence of pictures and give you the whole picture, overall picture of what was happening on this airfield. And I'd like to talk about our Heritage House Museum, because while Los Altos Hills and Los Altos started as one town, we separated over the years. And a couple of years ago, something wonderful happened. A group called the Apricot Alliance was formed by Abby Aarons, Frank Lloyd, and Ed Barnes. Los Altos' first merchant's home was going to be demolished, and they wanted to save it. So Abby Aarons and Frank Lloyd offered it to Los Altos Hills as a possible museum. Ed Barnes fell in love with the house, took all sorts of community abuse so that he could help people rally behind it, and Los Altos Hills accepted it, and it is now your Heritage Home Museum. We became one community again for a short time. And I think it was a sort of wonderful thing that we did.
It really did make Los Altos and Los Altos Hills really close.
It was a great feeling. We were both, that's where I met Rosemary, we were both part of the Apricot Alliance. And there must have been hundreds of man hours that we spent being part of raising money to refurbish the house after it got moved, and we had a weekend where we took people through. It was just a wonderful experience. How do people make arrangements to see Heritage House Museum?
Well, I'm at the town hall on Tuesdays from 1 to 5, or they can make an appointment with me.
Okay.
But it's usually open every day because 2 of the rooms are used as meeting rooms for our town. And I was given the job with Mary Stutz to furnish the house and try to find, freebies from the town.
That's kind.
But we did end up buying things and to furnish it in the time period.
Now, the house is what they call an arts and craftsman's house. These houses were greatly built all over the country from about 1880 to 1920. And what makes the house unique is that it's not unique. It's the kind of house that thousands of sort of small people, modest merchants, that kind of person lived in. And we save all these wonderful, gorgeous villas, but we don't have how most people lived. And that's what to us, when we were working in the Apricot Alliance, was the thing that made it so important. This was how we might have lived, and we wanted to save this house. If you have a chance to see it, it's a very typical arts and crafts house. That was the time when they started building things in. Adjustable shelves in a closet, a pass-through from the kitchen to the dining room. We think these things are modern, and they're not. Rosemary, I wish we could cover so much more. Could you come back?
Sure.
Again, oh, thank you, because
we haven't covered everything.
I know, we've just barely, we have this piles and piles of things we wanted to tell you about.
Each picture could make a whole meeting.
It's history is fascinating.
Yeah.
And I want to say to our audience, do you realize that you are part of your history? We're looking for pre-1940 pictures of apricot picking and drying of the old interurban railroad, class photos, turn-of-the-century horse and wagons, early cars, family events, aerial photos. If you have any of these things and would share them with us, would you contact us? And where's that address? Write to Los Altos History, care of Access Los Altos, 12345 El Monte Road, Los Altos, California, 94022. Share your history with us. I'm Nancy Schnabel, and I want to thank you for watching Los Altos History.